Hello and welcome everybody to this month's Janome Club. I'm Kathy from Janome, Australia, and I'm one of the educators based in the Queensland office. And today we are going to talk all things thread. So we're going to cover thread stands, thread caps, your tensions on your threads, and needles for selecting the right needle for your thread. Now, if you want help selecting the right needle or choosing the right thread for your project, your local sewing store will have the knowledge there. And you can always explain to them what fabric you're using and what threads you want to use, and they will help you select the correct bobbin or set the tensions on your machine. So what we're going to do is we're going to first of all go over and have a look at what sort of threads might be available. And I might get Peter to zoom in on this a little bit, or have a look at this, my little chart. So I've put on here a number of different threads that are just readily available in our local quilt shops. I've got a number of different brands, and I've got cottons, polyesters, acrylics, there, a rayon, polyester core, so all sorts of things. And I've made up this little chart, and I'm not exactly sure where Peter's zooming in, but from the top of the chart to the bottom of the chart, it goes up in thickness. So if we start right at the top, we're looking at a 100 weight thread, and then all the way down to the bottom, we go to a 12 weight. So the larger the number, the finer the thread. And with that, so you can sort of see that I could be sewing on my sewing machine everything from a very fine thread up to a quite thick thread, depending on the what I'm doing. The top couple of ones often are used in your bobbin and allow you to get a lot on your bobbin for, say, when you're free motion quilting or anything like that, or if you want a more invisible stitch. So if you're doing an applique by machine and you want it to be the stitching just to disappear into the seam allowance, you would stitch with something that is in the finer end. Whereas if you're doing like a top stitching sashiko sort of stitch, or even a decorative stitch, and you really want it to stand out, you would then maybe look at something that's more in the heavier weight threads, so that would stand out more for you. So with the different threads, what it is that you need to select the right settings on your machine and the right needle to go with that. So if we go up to our lovely needles here, and there are many, many needles available. Janome's use either the Janome brand or the Organ brand needles. And I have just put out here 3 different sizes. There is a 9, a 12, and a 16. And hopefully you'll be able to see that this is the larger the number, the thicker the needle for these. So you've got your 9, a 12, and a 16 there. We also do an 11, a 14, and there are various different needles depending on what fabric you're sewing. So if you're sewing a stretch fabric, you generally need a stretch needle. And if you're sewing a cotton fabric, you generally need a sharp needle. But as I mentioned earlier, please contact your local store and they can easily advise you of the correct type of needle. But today we're really more focusing on the size of the needle. So what you want to think is you've got to have to pick a needle size that matches your thread size, is sort of the way to think about it. So if you're using a finer thread, you can use a finer needle. If you're using a thicker thread, you obviously need a thicker needle. So if everyone sort of understands that, because if I try to put a thick thread, obviously through the eye of a really fine needle, 1, it's going to struggle to go through. 2, as the machine actually sews, it's not going to create the right stitch hole in your fabric to allow that thread to be able to pass through and form the stitch. And you'll end up getting skip stitches. So then we might move over here to our bobbins and bobbin cases. So the other thing is to use a Janome bobbin. They are made the exact right size to go in a Janome bobbin case. So the main thing is if you buy pre-wound bobbins, that sometimes they might not be, if they're not Janome, they might not be the right size, and you'll find that your bobbin case will rattle in the bobbin will rattle in the bobbin case. Or if it is, I have seen some pre-wounds that come like on a thin, small little cardboard tube. As that thread gets used up and there's less and less thread, that just bounces around and you can get knots and things in the bobbin. So we always recommend the Janome bobbins. And with our bobbin cases, we do a couple of different tension settings in different bobbin cases. Depending on what model you have, these will vary, but our standard has got a little tiny red check mark. I don't know if we can zoom in on any of those.
We'll see if I can zoom in.
So there are some models that have a yellow as their standard, but most of the core range have a red. So there's a little tiny red check mark there. Then if you've got an embroidery combo machine, you get generally a second bobbin case, which has got a yellow check mark and also a yellow dot. So we refer to that as our yellow dot bobbin case. That one is a tighter tension. And I'll be showing you some examples, an example soon to show you what having the right tension or wrong tension, how it affects your embroidery for that particular thing. And I've also got examples of general sewing. So that is our yellow dot. And then this one, which we commonly refer to as our blue dot, which has got the little blue check mark, is a lighter tension. So how that works with your thread is if you want a balanced stitch and you're using a particular thread, sometimes you need to change the tension. And if you have the different threads in your bobbin case, obviously you want to change the tension on your bobbin case. So rather than you having to muck around and adjust the screw on the bobbin case, you can then just buy the different bobbin cases. And if you need a looser bobbin case, you put the blue one in. You need a tighter bobbin case, you put the yellow one in. So it sort of saves a lot of that guessing work of adjusting the bobbin case for your different threads. And on a general rule, if I'm putting a thicker thread in my bobbin, you need a little bit less tension there so that it doesn't hold on to the threads, and sort of the reverse for if it's a fine thread, sometimes you might need a little bit more tension just because otherwise that thread will just slide through the tension disc. Okay, what's next? Oh, well, while we're on that, I might show you, I might just move my little threads out and I'll bring up my little samples to show you what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So this is a little embroidery sample. And on here, now I have to flip it over to have a look. The pink is, I think, a balanced tension. I think this is what we're doing. I have to think what we've got here. Yes, the pink looks reasonably balanced, I think. I think the pink is balanced, and you will see that you can only see the top thread. You can't see any of, I've just used a white bobbin fill. You can't see, but if you look at the word fabric, which is in yellow, I have deliberately loosened off my bobbin tension so that I will get the bobbin fill popping through. So you can see all that white is actually the bobbin fill popping through from the back. So therefore, if you are having this issue, you want to maybe either loosen off your top or tighten up your bobbin. And if I turn it over, you should be able to then see. If you have a look down at the blue one, so this is on the back, but if you have a look here, I can hardly see any white. There's just a little bit in the T. There's not very much white at all. So that to me is way too tight. You're going to use a lot of your top thread, which is, you know, our nice threads, and normally cost a little bit more than something like bobbin fill. Whereas you want a nice balanced sort of amount. I think it's the pink one. Yeah, you can see like about a third or to a half is the bobbin fill, and then a little bit of the colours popping around to the back. So that's an embroidery sample just showing you what happens if your tensions are not balanced. And let me show you here some little sewing ones. Okay. Let's just move this out of the way. Okay. Let's go down there. Okay, so here we have, I'll put the bobbin cases there. We've got, so what I've done is the top sample is done with a tight bobbin. So I've used the yellow bobbin case. The middle sample is done with the standard bobbin, and then the bottom sample is done with a loose bobbin. So one of the things that we often get calls about is people getting what we call eyelashes on their quilt. So depending on whether your eyelashes are on the top or on the bottom, depends on what you do to fix it. Now, if you can't remember, obviously, what I'm talking about today, and when you're doing this work, again, the staff at our local quilt shops and Janome Stockist sewing stores are very knowledgeable in this, and you could take them in a sample of what you're stitching if you can't think how to fix it, and just ask them and just say, can you recommend what I could do on my machine to help fix up my stitching? So if you have a look down here where I've done the loose bobbin, you can see that on my standard sort of setting, which is my default, this is free motion, I'm getting these little eyelashes popping through. So the bobbin is blue and the top thread is pink. This one here is quite balanced. And this one, I reduced my top tension down to 0. So on all of these, I started at the top 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10 on my tension. So this is my top thread tension. And if I go to this one, I'll turn that over. This is the tight bobbin. So this is eyelashes on the back now. So if you've got eyelashes on the back, there's 2 issues. The top one here, I haven't threaded it properly. That's probably if you're getting really big loops, check that your top thread has been threaded properly. Make sure your machine is either locked or the foot is up and you thread the top thread. Otherwise, you will get these really big loops and knots under, and you'll have to take your bobbin case out and clean it. So if you're just getting a few little eyelashes like this, what you want to do is you need to just tighten up your top tension. So if I just turn this over, this one, I've tightened it up to 6. So about 4 would have been my standard, and I had to tighten up to 6 to get a balanced stitch. So that's just a couple of examples of some of the showing you, if your stitches aren't balanced and, to get to a balanced stitch. Okay, so let's have a talk about some of the other things that we have available for your machines to help with different threads. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, can you see these? Yep, okay. So, depending on what model machine you have, we have 2 different ways that the standard thread stand is. Some of them are horizontal, so it's one that will sit across like the horizon. That is a horizontal spool stand. Then you have vertical spool stands, and a vertical spool stand will be up, pointing to the ceiling. So depending on what thread you're sewing with and what speed you're sewing at, you may find one is better than the other. As a very general rule, if your thread is on a cone, if your thread is on a spool, so these are spools of thread, they generally have the same sort of top and bottom. Generally, these like being more horizontal. Whereas if you have a spool of thread, which often has a base and a top, they generally do prefer to go more horizontal. But it does depend on the particular thread. Some threads are spun and wound in a particular way, and you will find some of them will prefer lying down and some will prefer standing up. So depending on what machine you have, some machines will come with a second spool stand. We're just going to pause. Sorry, we're just going to mute There's just some noise, background noise. Okay. So some machines that have got a horizontal spool stand will also come with a second spool stand that is vertical. So you then will put that in, I'll show you in a minute, you put that in the top of your machine. So that will then allow for your vertical spool stands to go on. Some of the machines, if especially like our higher end faster machines, like a 6600, 6700, 6650, a CM7, you will get vertical spool stands, and quite often they come with a little spool rest. So it may look like this or this. And these go on your spools and will hold like your bigger cones of thread. So if you've got an overlocker, you'll be quite familiar with this as well. So they would just slide over and that will hold your larger spools of thread to stop them rattling around. The other thing we have is our little stoppers. There's a lot. You sort of think, oh, all I need is thread and I'm right to sew. There's lots of little things that if you're struggling to get a nice stitch on your machine, there are lots of little things that you can do to improve that stitching if you're not getting the effect that you want. And it could be just changing your tension slightly, or it could be using one of our different spool stands. And quite a lot of, I think most of our machines come with both of the regular, the small and the large one. And we also have a special. Which we call it the special, the little one. And these, you sort of choose them to match like the spool of thread. So if I've got this is a rasant just with a very small little opening here, you can use the little special and that will just go in. So if I put it here, what I'll do, we also have these lovely spool stands. I'll put one on here. We'll zoom out here. Sorry, I'm getting myself. I'll put it on here so I can actually show you. So on the back of most of our machines, you will find there are 2 screws. To put either of these spool stands on, it's just a matter of loosening up the screws, and then the 5-thread. Yeah, I'll loosen them up a little bit more. The 5-thread and 2-thread. Yes. So the 2-thread, you have to take the screws out the whole way. The 5-thread, you can just slide it over and then tighten up the screws.
And you're only just nipping that.
I'm just tightening it so it doesn't jump around. You don't want to over tighten because it's just to hold it in place there. So I can now on my machine put a spool cap, spool stand. So I could put a larger spool of thread on and it will hold it there. I could put a smaller roll of thread here, or I could even put a smaller little cone. And if I put this one on, you might see if it rolls around a little bit, that's when you would then move it over to and that's on there. It's not going to jump around. So with your thread here, once you go up into your guides, and depending on whether you've got the 2-thread or the 5-thread stand, you then will also, these come with a little, I don't know where we're zooming in.
You just hold still.
Just hold it.
There you go. That's good.
This comes with the stands. It is a guide. And I will show you, I'll flip my machine around.
So we're on one of the Skyline.
I'm on oops, I pulled it too far up. I'm on a Skyline today, but most of our models do have those, unless it's already a model like the M7 or the 6700, they've already got vertical spool stands, whereas all the other machines that have got a horizontal spool stand as their standard have got the screws on the back for a vertical spool stand. So in the top of the machine,
no, you're right.
So in the top of the machine, there is a hole where you can put your secondary spool stand. This is not the right one for this model, but that's where you can put your secondary spool stand. if you do want just one thread, or the little guide that comes with the thread stand, the 5-thread stand, is a little guide for your thread. So I can then pull my thread the guide at the top.
So that's so it can go through the guide at the top.
Yep, and then it clips into your little guide on the top. So then when the thread comes off, it's coming off towards your tension in the same manner as when you have a horizontal spool stand.
Yep.
Horizontal thread there.
Yep.
So then we've got these little spool caps, and depending on what thread you're using, I find I use them in a couple of different ways. If I've got a cone like this, you can put the little thread stand on, and it's another way to hold it. So if I don't have my spool stand and you've got your thread on there and it might be jumping around a little bit, I tend to put my little cap on, and that will hold it in place. The other thing is for spools like this of thread, when they're getting very low, when you've only got a very small amount, they tend to sort of jump around sometimes when you're sewing, especially if you like sewing at speed. So that's when I will in particular use the little spool cap and just pop that in, and that will again hold that into position that it won't bounce around and come off. The other thing that the spool caps are good for is if you've got a thread that might have a particular twist or so on it. Maybe if I go to this metallic, some threads have got a twist to them, and when they come off the spool, you'll find that they'll start to really twist around. And quite often I find that giving a larger spool cap on there, the thread has to sort of like unloop a bit more around to be able to come off nicer.
Mm-hmm. That's going to be specialty threads.
Yes, specialty threads. And again, ask your store. They'll be able to advise you with your particular thread what's good for it. And the other thing that you do get with the spool stands, or you can buy separately, is these little nets. If you've got an overlocker, again, you probably have these as part of your accessories. And what they are for, I find them particularly good for a lot of your finer threads, a lot of your embroidery threads, or threads that are quite silky. And where they come into their own is if I'm stitching here and my thread's pulling off and then your machine stops, sometimes there's a bit of kickback with the thread, and the thread can sort of like loop round and can loop around itself and get caught and create a knot, and then you're going to break your thread. You could break your needle as well because it's so tight, because it's called into a knot. So what we've got is these handy dandy nets. And it's just like a little tube of netting. It's very stretchy, so it goes on pretty much any size of thread. And all I do is I just put it over the thread. You can fold it if your spools, this one's quite short. So I can just fold it in half.
You can trim them.
You can cut them down as well. Yeah, it just depends. I find I just fold it in half, and that holds it, and then I've still got it as a big one. Then when you use then as I take my thread, see, I'm twisted. I got twisted before.
Mm-hmm. You twisted it yourself.
I twisted it, yes. Let me just pull that down. So now when I unravel here, even if there's kickback, it's not going to loop down around the thread and cause a knot. It'll just sort of sit on top, and then it will keep sewing. So you don't get that issue. So that's the nets are really good for any thread that is got a bit tricky. And as I said, like metallics often, threads that have got that real, really sort of like slippery sheen to them. Even some overlocking threads or woolly nylons, if you're using your overlocker, sometimes I find that. So anytime you've got issues, that's another thing that you can do, is put your nets on there. I think we've pretty much covered most of things to do. I don't know if there's any questions Anyone's got a question or anything? Now, we do have a little accessory of the month that is using the thread stands that will be up on the website. And the project for that is this little key fob. We've stitched it on cork and we've used metallic threads. So we go through utilising the thread stand and the nets in this project so that you can get a perfect stitch in your little designs. But all of these options can be used for sewing or can be used for embroidery. It doesn't really matter what you're actually sewing. They can, you can utilise all of these little accessories. And a lot of them do come standard with your machine. So you might find you've got these little spool caps in your, I don't know where we are. Oh, you can go back to this camera.
I can go back to that, actually, kind of.
There you go. So you might find you have these little spool caps in your accessory case and you've never been sure what to use them for. And they are literally just to stop your thread from moving around, because especially when the threads are lying horizontally and you like sewing at speed. I like sewing fast. So I tend to find that if I don't have my little spool cap on there holding that in, sometimes the thread can spin.
You're talking the actual spool or the thread?
So the thread, yeah. So this can actually, like, especially when you sew fast, it can get a bit of momentum up and spin. So just having the spool cap on there will stop it from moving around, and that will work the same whether it's vertical or horizontal. So I hope I haven't confused you too much, but as I've said, the staff are the ones who will be able to help you. They can advise you. You can go in there and say, I'm using this thread, this fabric, please help me choose the right needles and help me choose what settings I might need to make on my machine to get that perfect stitch. So that's a good thing, that if sometimes if we're having issues with our stitching not being spot on, it can easily just be down to putting a cap on. So thank you very much for joining us today at Janome Club, and hopefully we can see you next month as well. Thank you.